So let's begin talking a little bit more about inclusion of students with disabilities. And to me, one of the first things we need to begin with is who are we talking about? What are the students we're talking about? And if we look at the image next to us here, oftentimes, yes, we tend to think of individuals in Catholic education very similar. Of course, they're wearing similar uniforms, and yes, there may be some diversity in respect to who we serve, but oftentimes we tend to think of these ladies next door in very similar ways. Maybe similar backgrounds, maybe the fact that they're all Catholic or they come from some sort of Christian background. Also expectation-wise, I would argue many Catholic educators or many people experiencing Catholic education have expectations. They figure that the elementary, middle, or high school experience in Catholic education is very academic orientated, very learning orientated, and maybe as we progress through our academic experiences, these young ladies are looking at 2 to 4 year colleges. Now, oftentimes when we think of these young ladies and we think of Catholic education, we tend not to think of these young men. We tend not to think of individuals with Down syndrome. We tend not to think of individuals with autism. We tend not to think of these students with identified disabilities. Instead, when we think of individuals in Catholic education, we think, no, they're very typical in many different ways. And yet, if we dig down into it and we start thinking about the inclusion of individuals with disabilities, and oftentimes this is where the conversation begins. Now we're going to accept some students with Down syndrome, often a sibling or two of some children we already have in school, maybe a child with autism, maybe a child with a specific learning disability. But oftentimes what we tend to fail to remember, or we tend to fail to make the connection to, is that many of the students that we serve currently in Catholic education are quite variable in their learning needs. That is, they don't necessarily come with the same type of similarities that we often assume in this idea of average or typical. Instead, they come to us with a variety of different backgrounds, a variety of different supports, a variety of different potential family expectations. There's a whole host of things that go into play. And to make this point, I want us to kind of think of ourselves, well, I don't want to kind of think of ourselves, but think of ourselves as potential college athletes. Now, what does that mean, Sean? Well, first of all, welcome to the university. You're going to be on full ride. And not only are you going to be on full ride, but we're going to support you in the clothes that you wear. Now, what sport might you want to play? Some of you might say basketball. Some of you might say football. Some of you might say cross country or hockey or field hockey or tennis or softball or baseball. The list of things goes on. But many of you that have been to college know in college education with our athletes, we tend to equip them with lots of different gear. And for those of you saying, well, wait a minute, well, no, not the University of Kansas, Sean, let's think more Notre Dame. And okay, I'm with you. Let's think Notre Dame. So now, welcome to Notre Dame. You're on a full ride, and not only on a full ride tuition-wise, but we are going to cover you head to toe, except for formal wear, in clothing. And I'm talking about winter wear, I'm talking about fall wear, summer wear, shorts, t-shirts, parkas, sweatpants, and of course, shoes. And yes, even you swimmers, you do dry land exercises, so you're going to need those shoes. But we believe, as some people assume, that there's this typical student. And we're going to go along with the typical, or we're going to go along with the average. We need to supply you with average sizes. So what does that mean, Sean? Well, the average size shoe we're going to give you, folks, is a size 8. Awesome. Size 8. I wear a size 8. Well, I'm sorry, a women's size 8. Oh, wait, no, I don't wear a women's size 8. Or for those that wear a women's size 8, congratulations. Maybe you wear a women's size 7.5. Awesome. Maybe an 8.5. Okay. But now you're like, no, I wear a men's size 10.5. Well, I'm sorry, but by December, we just accepted you, entered school in August, but by December, sadly, we're going to ask you to, either stop attending as an athlete and start paying tuition, or you're going to need to transfer. Because of this idea typical, of course, we're equipping you with a typical size. And yes, you're saying, Sean, this is silly, this doesn't happen. But the idea is, yes, it does when we think of the equipment we often provide in terms of textbooks, in terms of materials, in terms of activities, assignments. We often go with this idea that there's a typical, and yet there's a great deal of variability. Just when we think of these athletes and the size of shoes, there's a great deal of variability we need to think about when it comes to learners. And so the reality is, oftentimes when we think of learners, there's a variability that we need to consider that goes into the fact that, one, from a perspective of language, creativity, learning methods, and things of that nature, that there's not necessarily a typical. Now, Todd Rose out of Harvard University does a good job of illustrating that, and he does it in the context of pilots. And so let's go ahead and listen to Todd as he describes this idea of that averages is a myth, and the fact that there's a great deal of variability, and how if we plan and design for that variability, there's a lot to be said. So here you go. Let's listen to Todd for a few minutes.
And they don't know why. It's 1952, and the Air Force has a problem. They've got good pilots flying better planes, but they're getting worse results, and they don't know why. And for a while, they blamed the pilots. They even blamed the technology. And they eventually got around to blaming the flight instructors. But it turned out that the problem was actually with the cockpit. Let me explain. Imagine you're a fighter pilot. You're operating a machine that in some cases can travel faster than the speed of sound, and where issues between success and failure, sometimes life and death, can be measured in split seconds. If you're a fighter pilot, you know that your performance depends fundamentally on the fit between you and your cockpit. Because after all, what good is the best technology in the world if you can't reach the critical instruments when you need them the most? But this presents a challenge for the Air Force, because obviously pilots are not the same size. So the issue is, how do you design one cockpit that can fit the most individuals? For a long time, it was assumed that you could do this by designing for the average pilot. That almost seems intuitively right. If you design something that fit for the average size person, wouldn't it fit most people? It seems right, but it's actually wrong. And 60 years ago, an Air Force researcher, Gilbert Daniels, proved to the world just how wrong this really is and what it was costing us. Here's how he did it. He studied over 4,000 pilots, and he measured them on 10 dimensions of size. And he asked a very simple question. How many of these pilots are average on all 10 dimensions? The assumption was that most of them would be. Do you know how many really were? 0. Gilbert Daniels proved there was no such thing as an average pilot. Instead, what he found was that every single pilot had what we call a jagged size profile, right? Means you're not, no one's at the same on every dimension. And this makes sense. Just because you're the tallest person doesn't mean you're the heaviest. It doesn't mean you have the broadest shoulders or the longest torso. But this is tricky because if every pilot has a jagged size profile and you design a cockpit on average, you've literally designed it for nobody. So the Air Force realized they had a problem, and their response was bold. They banned the average, meaning that moving forward, they refused to buy fighter jets where the cockpit was designed for an average-sized pilot. And instead, they demanded that the companies who built these planes design them to the edges of dimensions of size, meaning that rather than design for, say, the average height, they wanted a cockpit that could accommodate as close to the shortest pilot and the tallest pilot as the technology would allow. Now, the companies that made these planes, as you could imagine, weren't happy, right? They argued and lobbied, and they said it's going to be impossible, or at least impossibly expensive, to build a flexible cockpit. But once they realized that the Air Force wasn't going to budge, suddenly it was possible. And it turned out it wasn't that expensive. And in fact, they made great strides. leveraging simple solutions that we all take for granted in our everyday lives, like adjustable seats. And as a result, the Air Force not only improved the performance of the pilots that they already had, but they dramatically expanded their talent pool. And today, we have the most diverse pool of fighter pilots ever. But here's the thing. Many of our top pilots would have never fit in a cockpit designed on average. So, most of us have never sat in the cockpit of a $150 million fighter jet, right? But we've all sat in the classroom. And I would...
So Todd's argument here, and a very valid argument, with the pilot's examples, is that there really is no average. And so therefore, if we're planning and designing for average, that's going to be tough. It's going to be a bit of a challenge. Also, if we take the same consideration and we bring it back to Catholic education, and we think of the literally millions of students that we're serving across the country, and we're trying to include, we literally are dealing with quite a variability of a group of learners, let alone a variability in a group of learners within the same family, let alone the same grade, let alone the same K through 8 or pre through K, or the 9 through 12, or the 6 through 8, or the 7 through 12, whatever it may be. And so if we look at Catholic education from that perspective, from the fact that today, yesterday, 10 years ago, we had a great deal of variability in the students we were serving, not identified. And yet today, as we look to include, if we go with this idea of variability of learners, and we go with the fact that we need to plan and design for some of that variability, or at least we need to go forward and start planning and designing for the variability of some of those learners, the inclusion of an individual with an identified disability that extends that variability shouldn't be too more problematic. So let's take the example of an individual with Down syndrome or an individual with autism. So that extended time, let's not just think accommodations. The fact that they aren't reading at the same grade level, the fact that their memory issues may be different, the fact that they may have more attention needs. Well, they're sitting in a classroom with students that are not reading at the same grade level. They're sitting in a classroom with attention being variable across the learners that we're serving. And this would just be an extension of that. Now let's pause here, and we'll come back to this idea of learner variability and its application in not only how we look at all individuals, but how we look to include individuals with disabilities in Catholic education, and equally important, how we bring that into planning and design. All right, we'll be right back on this learner variability part 2.